So everyone, my name's Brandon Green. I'm professionally a fitness professional. I've been working in the fitness and health industry for 17 years. I have an expertise in biomechanics and helping with motor control. And so professionally, what I do is I work with the most sensitive demographics, people who have major injuries, structural changes, diseases, things that are just stopping them from doing what they love. So instead of just being like the common personal trainer that you've heard of with a whistle and a tank top and flexing my muscles, I really focus on trying to create progression plans essentially to identify where someone's weakest areas are and help them create exercises to build up strength, endurance, and rate and force development so they can get back to doing what they love, which commonly leads me working to a lot of professional athletes and then seniors. One of the reasons why I love working with drummers so much is I am a passionate drummer, hobbyist drummer, 100%, hobbyist professional drummer, maybe. But one of the things that drives me nuts is that so many incredible drummers like us, more you than me, Mike, honestly, have messaged me saying, listen, my back is hurting so bad from playing the drums. I have to stop playing the drums because my back is hurting from playing the drums. And that just drives me nuts. And so that kind of prompted me to take some of my expertise in active range of motion, strength exercises, potentiation, all these other weird, nerdy things, and figure out, well, how can we share that information with drummers? More or less with my goal to try and help drummers keep playing forever, because essentially we have this incredible mechanical body and we can use this thing to play this incredible instrument. But we need to make sure the machinery is working well so we can actually take the car on the track. And so I'm just trying to do everything I can to kind of give back and help.
All right, so before we dive into how to prevent injury, what would be the first thing you would tell someone who has a sore back or even a herniated disc or something of that sort?
Yeah, it's a super great question. And it's, as you can imagine, there are so many answers. In fact, the client I was just with has a herniated disc. First and foremost, if you have a sore back, painful area in your body, the first thing I would recommend is try to identify what positions are uncomfortable and what positions are not. And that might not even be necessarily drum set related. But if you're sitting down at the drum throne and you notice my back's killing me when I sit a little lower, maybe raising the drum throne up might actually help a lot. There's something that we're going to reference a few times today, and I call it the Goldilocks zone. And it comes back to the herniated disc and the back pain. Planet Earth is in this beautiful habitable zone where if we go too close to the sun, we're going to melt and get incinerated. If we go too far away from the sun, we're going to get cold and have problems. So we're in this beautiful middle area. Well, all of our range of motions kind of have this same thing, how our body moves. When I'm sitting here, my posture's in this nice neutral position, and I can extend back as far as I possibly can and go forward as possibly as I can. And those two extremes, if I go too far one way, I get too hot. If I go too far one way, I get too cold. When we have acute pains, that field between hot and cold gets increased. And so basically we have to find which positions can we be in that don't hurt. And that's tough as drummers because in some cases, if we have a sore back, sitting on the throne alone can really be a problem. So first and foremost, try and figure out where it hurts. Second, the simplest thing as a blanket advice, and I would say first and foremost, go see a doctor for this, is if your back is hurting on the back side, which is such a cheesy thing to say, instead of stretching and really trying to put your finger in the sore, painful area without the professional aid of a professional support person, try to exercise the front. There's this incredible thing called common drive and co-activation. So if you have a sore back, if you exercise the front of your body, it actually creates this nice nerve connection that can actually help the backside feel better and move a little bit easier. I hope that helps. There's just so many different things we can do, but honestly, I mean, the best medicine is prevention when possible.
All right, so let's talk about the first step. Like, what is the number one thing for a drummer to consider regarding their setup or posture or ergonomics? Like, where do you start? What's ground zero?
Ground zero, in my opinion, has to be the drum throne because
Okay.
it's just such a familiar area. I mean, we sit in chairs, car seats, go on the toilet, drum thrones. I mean, ultimately, where we put our butt and the height we choose is huge. And that comes back to that Goldilocks zone. When we think of just the seated position that we are in, I know you're standing right now, but being in the seated position, my hips are close to 90 degrees. And when I think about that Goldilocks zone of motion, right? When I'm standing up, my leg is completely straight and I'm in this kind of like nice neutral area. I can balance on my leg for a long time. When I lift my leg up, kind of like this, if you're watching the video where I just pulled my knee toward my chest, that's as high as my joint can go. It's like 110 degrees of hip flexion. Well, if I'm already at 90 degrees, that means I'm pretty close to the sun. I'm pretty close to an extreme of motion. So if I can find a way to assess that and make sure that I have extra range of motion, I'm kind of in the Goldilocks zone more than closer to the sun, that's the best. So if anyone's listening to this, like as far as drum throne getting started, sit on your drum throne, find a comfortable position, make sure you're seated in the middle of the throne. And then what I want you to do, place the snare drum between your knees so you've got the right distance of where your legs are going to be before we put pedals down. Take your knee, draw your knee toward your chest as high as you can, and then do the same on the other side. If you can actually lift your foot up a good 2 inches and you're comfortable, your throne's probably in a pretty good spot. If you're playing really low and you can't lift your leg up at all, or it feels really, really tough and it gets sore and pinchy, we got to raise that throne up because we're too close to the sun. I don't know. Does that help, Mike?
Yeah. Now, what happens if you go the opposite and you sit too high?
It's a super great question. And actually, it's kind of a common thing. So when we get to that higher, taller position, what ends up happening is our body has to try to find a way to maintain our center of mass. And so this gets a little weird. And I'll see if I can do this with pens. So when we're seated, most of us are sitting at like a 90-degree angle of our knees, maybe a 110-degree angle. Well, if we get up to that higher end where we get close to 45 and 0 of our actual hip, we actually almost start putting weight down through our feet and almost in a half standing position. I've seen a lot of shorter drummers have to end up doing this. Like my wife's 5'2", and she'll try to play the drums, which she's stupid good for someone who's never plays, which is not fair. But I'll raise the throne up for her, and she gets this position where she's almost standing. What starts to happen is when you get to that tall position, and we have to use our hands to reach forward to hit most of our drums, like ride cymbals, rack toms. When we put our arms in front of us and we're tall, we have to actually find a center of mass. So if I'm sitting here and I reach my arms out in front, I have to almost lean back a little bit to maintain my center of mass over top of my bum, or I start leaning over the drum set. What ends up happening is if you sit too high, simply like soundbitey, if you will, your body's going to start finding motion at other joint systems. It's either going to extend your lower back more, it's going to make you lean back a little too far, or it's going to make it really, really awkward for pedal mechanics. So if you can, my best advice would be find a comfortable position, but find a position where the majority of your mass is actually on the throne. So if you're doing stuff with your feet, you don't feel like you're in this kind of like gingerbready back and forth style motion.
Does that mean sitting further back in most cases on the seat? Too many people sit up on the edge. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, a lot of people sit up on the edge. And for certain gigs, you can kind of get away with it. Like if you're playing like a pretty slow rock gig and you're like doing just a bass drum note every few BPM, like that's fine. But if you're doing anything that has any foot syncopation whatsoever, it gets to this point where if you're leaning too far forward, it's going to start making your lower back do a lot of side to side motions, way more than if your weight is back just a little bit. I wouldn't say lean back all the way, but if you get to a point where you're sitting on your throne with a tall posture and it feels comfortable, you'll notice when you put your arms in front of you, you're going to have to lean back like I just mentioned. But that little bit of leaning back because of reaching in front works well. Honestly, I mean, comfort and the range of motion assessment we just spoke about are going to be the two of the best barometers, in my opinion.
So the summarize is between 90 and 110. Is that what you said? Is kind of the sweet spot for most people?
I would say between 100, like at the hip flexion angle, between 100 degrees and 130 degrees. If we get over the 130, we start getting to that standing. I think 90 looks cool. It's kind of the soundbitey thing. Like every drum throne YouTube video will get to a 90-degree angle. Most of us don't have much more than 100 degrees of hip flexion. So if you're at 90, you're already there. So let's call it 100 to 130 as a soundbitey thing, in my opinion, so far.
Okay, let's talk about actual seat. Soft versus firm, round versus, motorcycle style, big, small. Like what do you find to be the ideal?
Yeah, super great question. A couple things, and there's one that you might attack me for, and I'll come back to it within a second. First and foremost, I'm a gigantic fan of any form of throne that doesn't modify how you have to sit on it. I'm a big fan of round just because it's extremely simple and our legs can drop down and move around it pretty well. There are some motorcycle thrones, which I can't recall the brand off the top of my head, so please don't shoot the messenger with this one. But those are also quite fine. There are certain versions of companies that have tried to make versions of the Carmichael throne where they use materials that are not as strong and as robust as they need to be, which can actually have a slight negative effect with how the position of the back is. Um, Short note, I would say, looking on the material end, one of the best things you can do is get the firmest throne that you can tolerate. And the reason why is if you think about, I mean, coming to a bed, right? When people pick a bed, everyone's talking about like Whisper Soft, Casper Soft mattresses. Well, if you think of like the geometry of a person, like if you got someone who is like a standard American male with a bit of stomach, not a lot, but a little bit more weight in the midsection, long legs, what's going to happen is when you sit on that mattress or you lay on that mattress, wherever the most amount of weight you have is where the mattress will dent in. And then your body has to change shape around that dent to work around it. So if someone's got a huge boiler, I'm exaggerating, of course, huge boiler of a stomach, it dents in at the boiler, and then you end up this bowing if you're laying on your side or stomach around the boiler stomach. Well, the drum throne's kind of the same idea. If you are a average 170 pound male, 130, 140 pound female, and you got a really, really soft throne that feels so good when you first sit on it, the upholstery and the actual fabric is going to change shape based off of you, which feels comfortable at first, but over time, it also means that since it has, unless it's really great quality, that amount of give, it will, as you sweat, moisture, the material will change shape over time and turn almost to like a Birkenstock style thing that changes to your hips and glutes, which again might feel good, but also might force you into positions over time that are not comfortable. The firmer of a throne you can have, the more your body gets to change shape as it will, if you will. Your body fat tissue, your muscle will go where it wants to go. So to summarize, I think a flatter, firmer throne, when applicable, is the best case scenario. There are some specific scenarios, like if someone has any sort of structural stuff, like with the actual tailbone or the sacrum has got some issues, or if you've got anything going on structurally where you need that space and you need to have that the cut in the middle or a motorcycle style throne, those are all great options, but flatter and firmer is better in my opinion.
All right, let's move on to pedal positioning. I mean, this is something I suffer from a lot when I sit behind a house kit, is having to adjust my body to the kit, and instead of thinking about actually just moving the bass drum or whatever. So how do you approach placing the pedals?
Well, I mean, if you don't mind me asking you, like when you go to a house kit, what kind of things are set up that you find yourself moving your body around for?
I don't move the bass drum, so
Like you're
just
sitting
that
close to it?
position. Yeah, just sitting maybe too close to it. It's aiming straight ahead, so I'm having to twist my torso to get in the proper position.
All right.
I often don't move anything.
Perfect. Well, I'm glad we're going to do this over camera so you don't have to smell my shoe. So the best way that I can answer this. So first and foremost, width wise, we have inherent restrictions of where the pedals are going to be width wise because we've usually got a 13 or 14 inch snare drum in between our legs, which always kind of brings up an interesting conversation because like I have a woman client that I see and she's in her 70s. So she's definitely older, but she can't actually open her knees from a seated position wider than 12 inches. Now that's a special scenario, but if there's anybody out there that just geometry wise, you can't open your legs wide, funny enough, an actual standard snare drum might be too big. And maybe there's a reason to actually use a 12-inch snare drum and tune it like a 14, but that's a whole other thing. So the width is a big deal. And that's where once we have that original drum throne height, seeing where your legs sit comfortably is big. And I've done this before. We've talked about this before, but when you're sitting in your drum throne, see how wide you can open your legs and how close you can bring them into the snare drum. Because if you're a Terry Bozzio, Marco Miniman style person with all these pedals on the left side, we actually need to make sure you actually have that range of motion available. But most of us are probably not, probably double bass, single bass, and a hi-hat. As far as pedal placement goes, where you place the bass drum, the simple answer is I would say make sure that your leg is just bent back just a little bit towards your knee. So instead of having that 90 degree, like if you're sitting at 90 degrees, which we already said you should be at 100, but just to make it visually easy, if you're at 90, your knee shouldn't be at 90, your leg should be out just a little bit. So it actually would be 100-degree angle at your knee rather than the 90. And the reason why it actually has to do with what the foot can do. In your ankle, we've got two different joints at the back that dictate how much front to back motion we have. The main one is called the talocrural joint. And it's a simple joint that's like a door hinge joint that lets your foot go front to back. Mostly there's some obliquity to it, but we'll just go with that. When you move your tibia closer to the toe of your shoe, so you bring the front of your leg closer to the tip of your shoe, you actually restrict how much dorsiflexion you can get. And so if you need to do this, place your foot on the ground in your chair, slide your knees over your toe. And once your knees over your toe, you can't actually lift your foot at all. And now we're at that extreme of range of motion again, the Goldilocks zone, where you physically don't have any range of motion available. And so if you're back just enough that you have just a little motion, this is working in very end range muscles. And the byproduct of this is where you get shin splints and like shin fatigue very quickly, because your muscles don't have a very big range. They're in a shortened position. So the actual skeletal muscle can't relax and produce ATP and actually recover quickly. And you get really, really burning shins. So you want to make sure you've got a little bit of extra space there. And I would say basically at a 100-degree angle from your shoe.
What about the hi-hat? You have a mirror image, or is it a different thing?
Honestly, I would say mirror image, in my opinion, is the best. Our body, there's the biological law of symmetry. We do well with symmetry. Also, if we're going to be playing lots of long gigs, I think making it as symmetrical as possible. You can get away with it. Like most of us, if you're a foot hi-hat open closer leg stomper where you're lifting your leg, you can get away with having it a little bit closer. I know Mark Giuliana keeps his a little bit closer, and you can see him pulsing his whole hip. I would advocate for symmetry, but again, if you have the range of motion available and it feels good, like a Mark Giuliana and like a lot of these jazz guys, that works. But I'm an advocate of symmetry.
Does that mean most people have the hi-hat too close to their body? Should it be further away in your mind?
In my opinion, they do. Okay. Now, I mean, of course, anyone that's listening to this that has been playing with their hi-hat close to them for decades, especially if there's anyone who's remotely good at drums and a professional, they'll tell me I don't know anything I'm talking about, and I'm okay with that. But there are some things that are important. Mechanically, if we're a bit symmetrical, we have way more foot motion, hip motion available. We already covered that. Second, if the hi-hats are too close to you, way more importantly, if you're playing traditionally, like a traditional, I should have had a drumstick right here. If you're playing traditionally and I have a pen in my hand, that means you have to internally rotate your arm and have a stick long enough and an arm long enough to actually hit the hi-hat without getting to a trunk rotated position. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, this is where most people get back problems. It's not just the throne. It's not just where the pedals are. It's the combination of all of those things and then being in an awkward position for a long time. And I know you and anyone else can relate to this. If you went through the high, I mean, you're maybe the same age as me, maybe a little older. I'm not so sure.
I'm older.
But like, I was like fully like Green Day, Blink-182 era. Like that's what got me into the drums. I'm sure a lot of guys who are around the same age as me, like 35, same thing. And the hi-hat was a huge thing. And if you ever actually played a gig with your hi-hat that high, like up by your eyes or your ears, like your arm got tired. You're like, I just got to do it. Well, though, that's a huge thing. That fatigue is an indicator that thing is in a position that's just not ergonomically friendly. I went through the other side of it where I tried to play them super low. Dennis Chambers vibe was like, well, how close can I get this thing? And then I found myself in awkward positions. I don't know if I can say that a lot of people have their hi-hats too close to them, but I do think that if someone does have their hi-hat close to them, they either need an extra long stick or you might find them turning a lot more to get there. And that creates a higher opportunity for issues with backs. I mean, using the late Neil Peart as an example, most of us know that he had some major back issues at the end of touring. Now, Rush, 3-hour-long gigs, huge, but his drum set was notorious for having stuff way over here and way over there. And you'd see him, huge tom roll, 6 inches all the way down. I'll tell you, you are in this extreme position to pushing as hard, rolling as hard as you can. You go down and around and you do a lot of that stuff. You'll get away with it in your 30s and 40s, but that stuff starts to show up as you get older. Now, all of us are not doing 3-hour gigs for sure, but it does start to show up.
I think the twisting thing is important to dive into a little bit more, like how to prevent that, because I know that's my biggest problem. Again, the bass drum is facing front, so I'm having to twist my torso in order to kind of get into a symmetrical position in a way.
Yeah. I went through because I've been studying mechanics so long, like right when I started studying this, I went through a gigantic fanboy phase of Mike Mangini. And it wasn't like, a lot of people got into him because of that whole, like, he had a crazy drum set with all the toms, which, you mean, really cool and unique looking. But that idea of the ambidextrous playing really started to focus on the idea of creating everything around your body and playing symmetrical, no crossing over. Now, there are some actual like really interesting brain reasons why learning how to play left hand with your right bass drum doesn't work so good. But the one thing that I think is a great takeaway from people like Mike Mangini, if you've ever seen Travis Orban on YouTube, he's done a great job of this, is that they create a setup that is extremely body centric. And I think it's important to take notes from their body centric drum set ideas and then put it into your drum set. Because when we sit down, I mean, in my opinion, this is the perils of most sports drums and instruments, is that we have this body that has restrictions and availability. It can do certain things and it can do some other things, and that's kind of it, the extremes. And then we take these instruments that we found, in the last couple hundred years, and we position them around us, and we place them in a way that are usually like, hey, this looks like a jazz drum set. This looks like a rock drum set. This 5-piece has these 2 pins in the bass drum, so I should probably put the 12 and 13 inch. Well, whoever plays with the 13 tom anyway, but this is where I should probably put this thing. And everyone that's ever bought a drum set, like the Pearl Exports and the common thing, that's where they put them. But we have to get away from that and build it around us. And once you do that, that's where everything starts to feel better. I mean, Mike, you could probably relate to this, but if you ever put an instrument in a spot that you had to work extra hard for, and you realize, I shouldn't have put that cowbell though, that kind of sucked, right? You're sore, your arm's tired, it's just awkward. So to answer your question, I think a lot of people are making that mistake, and it's just the easiest place to start.
What about snare drum height? I see a lot of really low, really high. Like, is there a spot that makes the most sense, physiologically? Is that the term?
Physiologically. Yeah. I mean, there is a soundscape component. I mean, you being someone who does so much stuff under the microphones, you know that certain positions and orientations might yield different sounds and effects depending on what you're going for. The easiest thing I can come back to is following our Goldilocks zone. So you want to make sure, first and foremost, that when you're striking the drum, actually, one step back. When you hit the drum, depending on the size drumstick, I actually have this thing called the dynamometer, which measures the net force reaction between two things. So if I take the dynamometer and I push my finger into it and I take it away, that will show me how much force happened between the dynamometer and my finger. So when I did that, it says 10 pounds. It means that the net force in between the plus and the minus was technically 0, but it took 10 pounds of force to stop it from moving. So I called the guys to Dario. They sent me some ProMark sticks, and I did an experiment. And we took some 7A maples all the way up to those fire grain marching sticks. I can't remember what model they are, but they're insane. And so when I hit the drum with a 7A drumstick, and I did a bunch of different strikes, like I did a full wrist strike, finger stroke, molar technique, a bunch of different things. But it ranged that the 7A would get somewhere between 15 and 22 lbf, pounds force per strike. And the fire grain sticks would get anywhere between 35 and 45 pounds of force per strike. Even the bounces were getting 35 pounds of force. Now, most of us know that if you have good technique, which is extremely broad, but you mean that you're efficient, you can move the sticks the way you want to, you get the sounds you want, and your hands are not taking all that force, we're not really getting 45 lbf when we hit the drum into our hands. But if we are in a position that forces us to be in a compromised joint position or skeletal muscle position, that's where we start to experience more of those forces. So on the snare drum specifically, this is for all drums, but for the snare drum specifically, we want to be in a position where you are as close to neutral with your wrist when you hit the drum. So I have enough range of motion availability both from the wrist joint and the fingers to actually help me absorb the force. If I hit something firmly and my wrist is actually in a bit of extension when I hit it, I have less shock absorption availability available. If I'm in a fully flexed position, I'm in the other end where I might actually start squishing my joint and compressing some muscles in a shortened position that might actually cause some unwanted close to carpal tunnel like syndrome. So I would recommend that snare drum height. There's a few different things to consider, but the simplest is anatomically, try to make sure that you are in the closest to a neutral position when you strike it. And what's interesting about that is if you are someone that is hitting the center of the drum consistently versus someone who's doing rim shots consistently. If you're consistently doing rim shots, that's where we might actually want the snare drum not to be flat, but slightly tilted by just 5 degrees. So when we actually hit the rim and the drumstick actually lands flat, if that makes sense. Versus when it's flat, we can probably get away with actually hitting the middle of the drum or angling it just a little bit more. But not many of us have to think that hard to go back to thinking the old Metallica days where Lars had the snare drum close to a 45-degree angle. And that truth, like, I mean, he was able to play that thing very well. He did good. I don't think he's got any wrist issues at all. But when you've got that drum at that 45-degree angle and I hit the snare drum, if I don't hit the drum at the exact angle of my wrist here and I'm hitting it at all like this to try and get the rim shot or my wrist is extended, that creates a ton of potentially of that 45 lbf going back into my wrist. Base the snare drum placement based around a neutral wrist position as best as you possibly can. And this goes with all the other drums if possible. There's some slight variances, but yeah, that was a bit long-winded, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, I mean, that thought of probably every time we hit a rim shot, we're having to flex our wrist the wrong way. And that's potentially very dangerous.
And I think if you get someone who's recording themselves with like 120p camera and we can actually like bring the frames down so we can actually see that, I mean, we would see that they're probably doing just a little bit of extension each time. And so I actually have like, I set up a, I actually set the measuring tape and my snare drum. I think I got the numbers right there because I just did a thing. It's 27.5 inches on the one side and 27.25 inches on the other side. And it's just that slight difference, but it's just enough that when I hit the snare drum, no one would visually notice. It looks like it's flat, but it's just enough that when I hit it, my wrist is completely straight and it helps a ton.
What's the next piece that you would add to the kit? So you've got your bass drum, hi-hat, snare drum set up.
So the floor tom is an easy one because it follows all of the same rules of the hi-hat. I just did a fun little video on this, but like super simple to figure out where your floor tom and or side snare drum should be. Keep your elbows fixed at your side. Get your elbows to, relatively speaking, a 90-degree angle, something where you're not going to hit anything. Hold drumsticks with the desired technique, and then just keeping your elbows in firm. If you externally rotate your arms and then internally rotate each arm, see if the drum you're trying to hit is within that position. So as much as this seems very robotic if you're watching the video, if I externally rotate this arm and internally rotate this arm, I would like the floor tom, if I put both sticks down, to be in this position. Now, I'm never going to hit the floor tom on the left with my left arm. Sorry, floor tom on the right with my left arm from this position. I will be reaching over to get there a little bit. But what this starts to do is it starts to make sure that I have to do the least amount of trunk rotation, least amount of motion to actually hit the center of the drum. And that's really the key. I mean, if you want an example of what I mean to be turning too far, deliberately place your floor tom 6 inches further away than you would. And you would see that you have to actually trunk rotate and turn over there. So arms in close, rotate over and make sure at least the tip of the sticks can hit the drum. When you're actually in performance mode, you don't have to think about it nearly as much.
Now, for anyone who's not watching the video, to point out, you're saying rotate just the arm, so your upper body torso doesn't move.
Yeah, so very strictly, the assessment is keep your elbows at your side, hold the drumsticks, turn your hands so you're holding the sticks with whatever technique you're doing. Don't move your trunk, don't move anything. Just rotate your arm internally towards your torso and then reach out as far as you can, keeping your shoulders and trunk as still as you can. In my opinion, instruments that are going to have 80% or more playtime should be within that field of area. So if we get a bit excited and we do another joint motion, like we turn our spine a little bit, we're in a much safer spot than if it's something extreme. The really common example actually is if you have a 14-inch and a 16-inch floor tom, that 14-inch should be as close to you so you don't have to work very hard to hit the center of it. That 16-inch, it's very unlikely your left arm from this example is going to be able to internally or rotate enough to get the 16-inch floor tom that's away from you. If you were going to practice doing single strokes and you do it from your drum throwing spot and you go to the floor tom and you actually practice playing single strokes over there, you're going to feel you have to turn and move your shoulders. That instrument, in my opinion, if you're going to be getting a lot of playing time, I would find another position for it. Perhaps a left side floor tom or a rack tom. Don't have it that far over there if you're going to be playing it for a lot of your gig, because that's where back issues start to pop up.
All right, so this is the next confusing bit for me. Like, I know the ride cymbal should be the next thing because you're going to play it the most. But there's a restriction inherently. Let's say you have 2 rack toms. I don't play two rack toms for that reason, that I need the ride cymbal to be in a comfortable spot somewhat in front of me.
Yeah.
But let's say you have to have two rack toms. Would it be better to go higher, closer to the center, or lower, further to the right? Or is there
Love it.
some other position?
Love it. I like to visualize NASA star controls, like when someone's in a space shuttle, when they're thinking about all the other stuff. Because one thing they did that was super cool is if you like, not joking, you look inside of a space shuttle, right? The buttons that are like right in front of them are like kind of on a gradient angle. So when they put their hands up, they don't have to move very far. And as they get closer and further away, the things are getting flatter. So their arms can stay closer to their body. And I think this is kind of what's cool about high cymbals placement kind of coming back, is because I think we went through like this generation in the 90s and 2000 where like low flat cymbals were cool. I know, they look kind of cool. So to answer your question, I am a double rack tom person. I love it. And I play with two rides most of the time because I don't play any actual gigs and I'm just kind of like that drummy guy right now. It's kind of fun. And when I think about like that placement, it is in that kind of NASA star control idea where following those rules, if I have, to your examples, the ride low and to the side or kind of middle and higher, forgetting about just telling you my opinion, if we go back to that assessment of holding and we do that floor tom assessment, well, if I turn my arm out to the side and I have it low, you don't have to try that hard. If you keep your arm close and you turn out as far as you can, you're going to feel that tension across the front of your shoulder. You're getting close to the end range of motion. This is one of the extremes of the Goldilocks zone where we can't go any further. The car door can't open any further. So if I'm operating from this extreme, even if it's comfortable-ish, and I'm playing a ride there, and I'm playing a jazz gig, or I'm playing something that requires, again, a lot of playing time, you're going to get tired faster. Those internal feelings of like, hey, I don't feel any tension here. Hey, I feel some tension here, but it's okay. That tension feeling is your body internally telling you we can't go much further. Tension is the language of the body. So I would encourage that closer to center-ish, higher-ish position following those same rules. And so you can kind of see, you can't, I mean, if you're watching the video, I got like a drum set behind me, but that's basically what I've got is I've got the ride relatively centered, kind of high. And it's almost that if I follow what I said with the snare drum, there's slight angle on the snare drum, slight more angle on the rack toms, and then a slight more angle on the cymbal. And forgetting about the different materials, it's kind of following that NASA idea where there's kind of this progressive going up, flat, little more angle, a little bit more angle. But again, I mean, Mike, it's a great question. I would say follow with what your body feels the most comfortable. Like that's the greatest thing. And if we start getting into the idea of doing motion assessments, there's no instrument here. Can my body go to this position? Wait, I feel some tension. Where do I feel no tension? If we follow those internal tension barometers, we're going to be in a much safer spot.
What do you do with the rack toms? Do you put the bigger drum in the comfortable spot and then move the smaller drum to the left? I mean, how do you position those?
It's kind of like that same, essentially, yeah, I think that's the best way to go with it. Is that how I think of it personally is if I've got the two, I got my snare drum, I have a 10 and a 12 because that's way cooler than a 12 and a 13, obviously. I've got the 10 and the 12. I put the 10 directly in front of the snare drum. So that's pretty much just a straight shot. And then the 12, rather than being just parallel to it, like I was putting it in a bass drum, is kind of on a slight angle in between the 10 and the floor tom. So it's almost kind of starting to fall down into the floor tom. So instead of it being like, I think there's this traditional idea, actually Todd Zuckerman does a great job of talking about this as well, where you've got like, this is one level and then floor tom is another level. I think it's a nice melting between the 10, 12's a little lower and the 16's a little lower. And that just helps us if you're into the whole, I think Mike Johnson calls it around the world kind of fills, which I'm a big nerd of. If you want that, you want to make sure that everything is kind of following a smooth flow rather than like if you're watching the video up, 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 down, down. It's like that's kind of awkward. Rather, if I can make it a seamless transition, that's great. And again, if you need another visual representation, Todd Zuckerman plays with a ton of floor rack toms. He does a great job of making them flow, even with like I think 3 or 4. And then Mike Mangini's old symmetrical kits, he did a great job where it's not really like rack tom and floor tom, even though they're technically those. Between the 6 and his going all the way out, you can see they kind of fall down into the floor tom. And I think that's just the smoothest and easiest way to go. But come back to the NASA idea. It's just this nice smooth gradient. Instead of like black and white, it's just this nice gradient.
All right, crashes. We've got the left and the right, but I mean, is that the best spot for them, and how high and where should they be?
Well, I mean, best play, you know what? It's a great question. It comes back to like playing ability. Like, what are you going to be playing the most? Um, and what also are you going to be doing them with them? Like, if you are these Matt Garska, very common high energy metal kind of guys, and you just need to hit the side of the cymbal at the right angle so you don't shred drumsticks, the simple soundbitey thing, like without getting too far into it yet, is following that same NASA, that nice gradient of how do I have a slight angle and positioning it just that I can, from a comfortable position, hit the tip of the crash to achieve the desired sound. If you are a jazzy, Latin kind of guy and you're actually playing some of these lighter cymbals, actually, Mark Juliana again is a great example, not necessarily even crashes, but super, super light rides on the crash continuum. We need to make sure that we have them in positions that we can play all the different playing surfaces. So again, following active range of motion and keeping your body in the best position possible is great. My best recommendation to any drummers is if you have two crash cymbals, heck, even three that you play frequently for recordings or for a gig, place them somewhere within that position I spoke about earlier for the hi-hats. Externally rotate your arms, find where it's comfortable, and then kind of come in. And you'll find, like for me, I've kind of got this 90-degree window, 45-degree on the left and 45-degree on the right, and all of my main stuff is in there. Try to find a position that feels the most comfortable, but the types of gigs that you're playing is super important. I'm a gigantic fan, actually, from a functional sense. I think, thinking of some of those multiple crashes, Matt Garska's got an interesting setup where he's got the two crashes over to the top left, and he's got all of his China stuff over to the right. And when you watch him play, like, I know he's very popular right now, but it's nice because you get two crashes, two different loud sound sources for that type of gig he doesn't have to reach. He's got his hi-hat, he just moves the stick over and he hits a cymbal and hits another cymbal. And then he gets way more ferocious by smashing his China cymbals over on the side. Well, that makes a lot of sense, somewhat. Or we could move it kind of in between us and have it in front. The thing that we start to get into this weird issue of is how many cymbals are you going to play? How many do you need to play? And also, I hate saying it, but what looks cool is a really big problem. I mean, I've heard people you've interviewed before, you've asked about drum set things, and I've heard people talk about, well, I just like where it looks. It looks cool there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a real common thing too. Where's it the most playable? Where can you get the sounds you like? And what works best for your body?
Excellent. How about moving between instruments? Is there something that we should consider? Where do we lead? What part of the body should be controlling those movements? How do we do that without hurting ourselves?
That's a super awesome question. And so are you thinking both kind of tom rolls, or if I'm going from one side of kit to the other?
Both. Let's say you're going from hi-hat position to ride position, or you have to go quickly to the toms or something, like quick motions versus smooth transitions. Like, how would you think about it?
I think trying to practice using your trunk to do it and keeping your arms as neutral as possible is a great thing. There are specific tempos that it is going to be functionally impossible. Like your example with the hi-hat to the ride. The number of people, like if I said, hey, try and do that with your trunk, that gets really tough to go back and forth with your trunk, especially if you're going back and forth with eighth notes or 16th notes or something like that. And so for quicker stuff where it's just kind of like back and forth, I've seen a few different things. There's this thing that I've seen a lot of is where someone will take their wrist and they'll actually change their wrist technique a little bit where they'll kind of flop in and out. Musically, that works well. Like sonically, you can get the sounds that you want, but you get to some really interesting wrist positions. And I'm not a big fan, especially on the back side of it. One, if you're playing between two different sound sources, like two different rack toms, hi-hat, ride, practice doing it from the shoulder strictly, but try to see if you can keep everything as still as you possibly can. See how that feels. When you're in playing mode, if you're playing specifically that pattern, I don't know anyone that would play that exactly, but you go ride hats, you'll start to get a little bit of trunk involved and that'll be okay. On the kind of larger, more energetic, choppy, solo, higher frequency energy end, I would recommend, like, if you're going from one drum to another, like if you're just playing groups of three, floor tom, hi-hat, and going back and forth, I'd recommend thinking way more about the trunk and leading from the center, because we can get way more torque, way more speed by turning our torso a little bit than if we move our arms. The simple thing is if we just think about a circle and I've got the axis of the circle and I got a 1 inch dot away from it and then I got a 6 inch dot away from it. Well, if I move that 1 inch dot down just a little, that's 6 inch. Like if I move the 1 inch dot down just a centimeter, well, that one that's 5 extra inches away is going to move 6 centimeters. So if I move my centimeter or my axis of rotation is around my spine, I don't have to move very far to get huge motions to happen. But on that note, like from a very athletic end, I would encourage any trainer. You can tell what I talk about most days. Working with fitness professionals, I would encourage any drummer to actually like set up some mechanical exercises and go, okay, I need to work on my speed a little bit and my endurance with going back and forth between this thing and this thing because I got to do it for this gig. Set a metronome and actually practice mobility exercises. There's so many examples of like taking rudiments and breaking them up over drums. But I think like the most bare bones example is taking either double strokes or single strokes. Pick your two furthest away instruments and find a tempo and subdivision you can practice actually going from one to the other. I noodle around with floor toms on both sides, left and right. Never have I ever gigged with a left floor tom. But when I'm at home, I do it as an actual exercise mechanical thing. And going from one floor tom to the other and practicing going back and forth and switching subdivisions is one of the best things because even though that's an insane feat of athleticism to do the virtual Donati speed, if you get any bit of speed better than where you are now, the normal stuff you do from a hi-hat to a floor tom, from a snare to a floor tom, just ends up happening faster and you have this nicer field of Goldilocks zone, so to speak. I hope that helps, but I think that's a lot of fun.
Is playing the drums good for you or bad for you?
Yeah, man. Well, that's a good question. I mean, you could, it's funny. I remember asking one of my mentors this because I was like, hey, listen, we were talking about symmetry for this whole course. It was like a year-long internship on symmetry and range of motion. Like, hey, listen, I do this thing called the drums, and it's asymmetrical. Am I going to die?
Yeah.
And he goes, no, there's lots of things that are. So truthfully, the drums are not bad for you. They're great because truth is, if we position the drums in the right position, we're doing a lot of incredible things. Like from a health end, once we get this ergonomics thing figured out, I think it's one of the healthiest things that you can do as an instrument. Like of all instruments, percussive instruments are so healthy because I mean, if we think about all of the components of longevity, we're getting older. Well, what are the things that break down? Well, there's cardiovascular health. There's skeletal muscle deterioration. There's bone deterioration. There's lots of mobility and lots of speed. There are things that happen from an Alzheimer's brain deterioration perspective. Well, if you're practicing the drums and you're trying to challenge yourself a little bit, every single organ system, minus some digestive ones, are involved. And that's super cool. I mean, this is where there's a video that you've probably seen of a few old boys who are like 80 and 90. One guy on a piano, one guy on a drum set. And like, they both look like they got Alzheimer's. They both look like they got hearing aids, look like they're falling apart, but they're still playing music. There's something beautiful about that. Drums inherently, just like all physical things, have risk-benefit relationships. And that's why I want to even share this stuff with you and anyone that'll listen, is as much as someone ever like, well, he's waffling a lot about anatomy and stuff that I don't care about. You don't right now, but I guarantee that you will one day, because there will be a day where we get older and we start to slow down. And I see this with hundreds of people in my business every day. And if we can get on top of that today, this becomes the healthiest instrument. Because if you think about guitar players, I mean, they're not working their muscles. They're just, doing this stuff. And sometimes their tongue gets out and that's about it. Drums, we do everything. And so obviously I'm biased, but like taking it from the most scientific view possible, I think it's one of the healthiest instruments you can play from a longevity. And I think it's just awesome.
Let's switch into health and fitness for drummers, if you don't mind. So is there if you had to give someone a daily routine, what should they be doing to keep their body in optimal shape to play drums?
Great question. I have two answers. And I will say that if anyone is checking this out and you're listening to the audio, find where Mr. Dawson has placed the video, because I'm going to showcase a couple quick things and it'll make it easier, but I'll do the best I can to be as verbose as possible with it. There's two things. So health and fitness fitness things for drummers. The first thing I would ask everyone is like, well, what is the goal of this exercise routine? Is this exercise routine intended to help you with playing the drums? Or are you thinking, hey, I want to work out and just, grow my body, get muscular and get stronger, but have it also sort of lean back to playing the drums? Those are two different things for sure. And I would say I partake in both of them. on the drummer end, the most basic things possible. I would encourage everyone to think about what are the primary joints that you use when you're playing the drums. We don't have to think that hard to really think, okay, there's postural component, like my back. There's a hip component, because again, if you're watching the video, you'll see, right, there's a part where we lift our leg to play big bass drum strokes potentially. There's also a part with our feet that if we're playing heel down or heel up, that we're doing this kind of front to back motion. There's some elbow stuff a little, shoulder stuff a little, and hand stuff a little. If we break it down to the 3 simplest exercises possible, to make it kind of super easy. Why did I put my shoe aside? I need to wear this later, right? The first one, which is surprisingly hard, is actually a hip and core exercise, and it's just hip flexion. So like I said a second ago, sit on your chair. Remember that active range of motion assessment we did where we pick your leg up to see how high your drum throne should be? If you're watching this in the future, we talked about that. You want to see where your drum throne should be, lift your knee up as high as you possibly can and see how much range you have available. Well, that actual range of lifting your leg up as high as you can and coming back down, if you repeat that 10 times, anyone who's watching this, sitting, lift one leg up as high as you can, come back down with some control, your hip gets tired pretty quickly. Most of us do not exercise our hip flexors locally ever. There are mostly not hip flexion exercises, even if you go to the gym. Squats, deadlifts, kettlebell swings, they're all kind of like glute, posterior, back centric. So one, pick that leg up and down, controlled ranges, do 10 to 20 of them. Great way to work on hip flexion, working on a little bit of abdominal strength, and maintaining that range for drumming. 2, if you don't have access to a drum set, I would encourage you to do, this is actually 2 exercises, heel down toe taps. Anyone that was ever in high school that sat there and you tapped your toe, you know how tired that shin muscle gets, that tibialis anterior. Working on the endurance of that thing will never hurt, because building that up is going to help you do faster stuff, play longer. It's going to be great. On that same end, standing calf raises, very basic exercise, planting your heels on the ground, lift your heel up. That's a great thing to do. You could do them seated, but probably not enough resistance. So that's actually 3 exercises already. And then the last one, which is so basic, and I just did a YouTube video on this, but it's like, it's insanely powerful, is take your hands on a practice pad or wherever you are and practice actually playing the drums just from the wrist. Now we've all, every drummer is like, I play the drums, right? That's great. But pick some rudiments, set a metronome actually, and accents and flams and diddles and all that stuff. Find tempos where you can actually do the stuff you want to do with your wrist on the pad and set time limits and actually do that. You can grab weights and bands and do all that stuff. But truthfully, if we're just on the drummer end, I'll tell you what, you set up a practice pad and paradiddles at 140 BPM, 16th notes, and you play strict paradiddles all from the wrist for a full minute, you will get way more tired than you think you will. And this builds large primary muscles up around the wrist. And if you're feeling super extracurricular, and this is an idea I got from Chris Coleman, a Chris Coleman clinic, full disclosure, do it with the wrist, then try and do the same thing just from your fingers. So don't let the wrist move at all on the pad. Try and play just the fingers, rudiments. And if you want, the toughest one is play just from the thumbs and play actual rudiments just from the thumbs without moving the wrist, because the thumb is a major fulcrum force managing point for all drumstick control, whether it's traditional or match technique. So there's a ton of exercises, but I would say like those are the basic ones for drummers, just doing body weight. And if you're like, hey, Brandon, those are all easy for me, great. Take some weights and tapes a little 1 pound or even half pound weight on the back of your wrist. Do the same thing. And I do mean tape it. Put a little weight, put it on your shoe. Try and lift your leg for the hip flexion. Do the toe taps. All of those will be far more functional. Going to the gym, the simple thing I would say, like there's just, as you can imagine, like so many things to unpack there. But I would say 1, make sure you're doing nothing that causes discomfort. And especially with a super bias, because we're drummers, on anything that we're going to play drums. If you're going to the gym, starting to bench press, cool. You're going heavy, cool. Your wrist is kind of pinching when you're doing it, stop. We don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize that. We could definitely do a whole episode on just workout stuff for drummers in the future if you'd like. But on the body weight end, that's the best place to start for sure.
Yeah, I could go down that rabbit hole, but let's not do that. Is there one strength training exercise that, let's say you need to get fitter, you're falling apart. Is there 1 or 2 strengths or cardiovascular exercises you would start with?
You know, it's so funny. Well, first and foremost, there's no best exercise if anyone ever asks. But I would say the exercise, like from a health end, just broad health end, that I have returned back to time and time again, is actually a controlled reverse lunge. And the reason why over like a squat or a kettlebell swing is that when you do a reverse lunge, so a lunge is when you're standing and you step forward and you kind of bring your one knee to the ground and you keep your front foot flat and your back foot's on your toe. I don't like the front lunges, especially for anyone who's a little bit older. If you're listening to this, like over the age of 55, 60, because there's a bit of a weightlessness and a catch. Reverse lunges, there's always a flat foot and you can always eccentrically control the lowering. I've been coming back to reverse lunges for both of your questions, fitness and cardio, because one, you get to work on right to left strength. You see if you have any differences at all. And if it feels good, you can actually just set it for time, set 45 seconds and go, okay, I'm going to go as fast as I can with this with control. And people get stinking tired super fast. And drummer bias, you're getting into a lot of ranges like that hip flexion range and slight trunk rotation that biases the drum set for sure. So I'm a big fan of reverse lunges if it's just a broad stroke paint roller fitness technique.
Right. Okay, we can wrap up maybe with any kind of diet or nutrition or pre-game, post-game rituals that you think would be helpful for drummers.
So I will say this first and foremost, I am not a dietary expert. I've studied a lot of it and I've got a lot of friends who are. So I do have some ideas that I'm happy to share. If any of you are like, I am eating and I'm having problems and I don't feel good, go to the doctor right away. And if I make a suggestion and you don't like how it feels, this is just my personal opinion, not professional opinion. So I have nothing to tell you. But I would say a couple things. One, if you're going to prepare food before playing a gig, one, don't fill your stomach up. As if you have like a full meal, there is a bunch of digestive fluids that are created and blood flow that gets modified to help support that enteric digestive nervous system. And so that's not great because it takes away blood flow and energy to other parts of the body. And if you get to that point where we've all done this, you know, the whole don't swim after eating for 30 minutes, same kind of idea. If you start playing an intense gig and you got a full belly, that food's just going to sit there and your energy systems are going to focus on the performance. So don't eat full. The biggest thing I do is I literally have a small meal, 45 minutes or 45 minutes to an hour before I play, and I don't have anything else. I would not recommend alcohol, as you can probably imagine, but that's, you know, drummers are drummers, so that's a whole other thing. Type of calories. I would definitely recommend, if you do not have some sort of gallbladder issue or digestive issues, to have a concentrated healthy fat with a small protein. Something like a third a cup of almonds and cashews with a small protein source, like if you like eggs or a little bit of chicken or something like that, is a really, really great thing with a little bit of vegetables. Like my favorite is I'll have a protein bar or like a company called Good Fats. They're just healthy fat. And I'll have a third of a cup of almonds. It's light. It gives me the energy I need and I can go perform and have no issues. I am not a fan of recommending carbohydrates of any sort as an energy source, especially sugars, candies, and things like that, because what will happen, depending on your insulin sensitivity, you'll get a huge spike of energy and then crash. If you've got a really good healthy carbohydrate management system, then you can probably get away with it. But truth is, it does spike our insulin. It does modify our cognitive behavior in most people most of the time. So, one, don't fill your stomach. Two, if you can, have some form of healthy fats, not a McDonald's cheeseburger, but like avocado, duck fat's even a good one. Bacon to some extent, depending on the type that you're having, if it's got like low nitrates in it, almonds, all those kind of things. And then eat your heart out after the gig.
Mm. Anything physically to do to wind down after a gig, or is that a little bit mythical?
Honestly, truth is, it's a little bit mythical. I would say the most important part would be on the heart rate end. Is if your heart rate is super, super high and you're playing like a very, very intense gig, I'd recommend like not just walking off the stage and going and sitting. I would like recommend actually doing some walking to actually slowly bring your heart rate down and cool down just a little bit. From a mobility perspective, the idea of stretching post activity is kind of a myth. If you like it, go for it. Truth is, it won't necessarily modify recovery. In some cases, it actually increases muscle damage. There's a great research paper by Brad Schoenfield that showed that doing stretches after resistance exercise actually created more hypertrophy And the hypothesis was because it created more mechanical damage on top of the exercise. I'm a big fan. If you have an area that gets tight, do some motions on it, like squeezing it, contracting it. Like if your hip gets tight, do some of those hip flexion ideas. And yeah, don't be too aggressive. And also make sure you rest, because most people do too many gigs in a row. And if you rest, give yourself a day or two, then you can actually feel much better for sure.
Sweet. What about hydration? That's my last question. How important is hydration?
Hydration is super important. I mean, I will sound cliche with saying this, but having at least 1.5 liters and 2 liters of water per day is huge. If you're someone who's not drinking water, what you'll start to notice is if you start adding it, yes, you'll pee more at the very beginning because your body's just not used to it, but you'll notice your energy feels higher, because if you're in any state of dehydration whatsoever, it just decreases cognitive performance. And the majority of our cells, our entire body is made up of a ton of water. So the more we can do to replenish that and help to support ourselves, it's just huge. It won't give you energy like as a standalone mode, but I mean, listen, this is not my expertise, but anyone's listening to this, drink more dang water. Come on. Like just have more water.
I've heard like a gallon a day. That seems a bit extreme.
Just start with 2 or 3. Start with 2 liters and then work your way up from there.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. That was great.
Oh, my pleasure,
Learned
man.
A lot.